Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this Zoom webinar. It's so exciting to see so many familiar names and faces and partner organizations here. Um, I'm Aubrey. I'm the Volunteer and Community Engagement Manager for those of you I haven't already gotten to meet. And today we're going to be talking about the refugee resettlement process. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, walk through the agenda, and introduce my colleagues. Today, this is what we're going to be going over. First, Rachel will present on how refugees reach Pittsburgh, and then Dustin is going to give us a more national perspective. And then for the last 15 minutes, we're going to have time for some Q&A. So Osfi, my colleague here in the yellow sweater, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Asfi. I'm the project management coordinator.
So Osfi is facilitating the waiting room. He'll be admitting people into the Zoom call and checking the chat. So you can drop questions into the chat as you have them. And at the last 15 minutes of the session, we'll be going through as many of the audience questions as we can get through. Dustin and Rachel will answer. Osfi and I will jump in as needed. So without further ado, we have some staff members that you might not have had the chance to interact with yet presenting today. So Rachel's our VP of Programs and Dustin is our National Membership Manager. And both Dustin and Rachel have worked for years on a project called the Hello Neighbor Network. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to introduce herself a little bit more and go over the first set of topics. And then Rachel will pass it on to Dustin.
Awesome. Thanks, Aubrey. Hi, everyone. So glad that so many of you made it today. As Aubrey said, my role at Hello Neighbor is VP of Programs. So I oversee our resettlement program, which is what I'm going to discuss today, our family services programs, which provide wraparound support for families for years after they arrive to Pittsburgh, and then the national network, which Dustin will speak to specifically. A number of the slides that I'm going to walk through are from our partner, USCRI, and I will describe what our relationship is with them in a little bit, and those are mixed in with some of our Hello Neighbor slides also. So I think many of you are volunteers, you've worked with us before, and you might already be familiar with this definition, but just in case, a refugee is someone who's been forced to cross an international border because of a well-founded fear of persecution, and you can see some of the reasons listed there. This is different from an internally displaced person who would fit this description, but they are forced to relocate within their own country. And refugees are eligible for the resettlement program. So this is our resettlement team at Hello Neighbor. So if you've done any volunteering with resettlement, these faces may look familiar to you. Andy is the director of that department. Kelly is the supervisor. Jen and Munib are our case managers. And then our case aides are listed at the bottom. Is everyone able to hear us okay?
It'd be great if you can hear us, if you could confirm in the chat, because it looks like some people are.
Yes, okay, wonderful.
Okay. Thanks all.
Excellent, so good. Yeah, so this is our resettlement team. And within the resettlement department, there are three main pieces. So there's reception and placement, and that goes from the day that somebody arrives at the Pittsburgh airport and we pick them up in our Hello Neighbor van and take them to their first home in the city, up through day 90. And in that time period, we're responsible for a certain set of things that I'm going to describe. We have employment within the resettlement department, and that helps job seekers find employment within those 90 days and beyond. And then legal, which is a new program of ours. So the next slide, I won't get into all of this detail, but our employment program team, you can see on the left-hand side, we have two employment programs within there, and the ultimate goal is for families and individuals to achieve self-sufficiency. which is just basically defined as having an income that's equal or greater than their expenses. And then our legal services department is pretty new also, and we're still figuring out what this will look like. But essentially the goal of these services are for clients to have a permanent, stable immigration status and hopefully citizenship at one point. So right now, our legal fellow, Gina, is working just with clients who are already internal to Hello Neighbor. This is a really big need across the city and the country. So we want to do as much as we're able for the folks who are enrolled in our programs. So a little bit about the history of refugee resettlement. This started in the United States when we admitted more than 250,000 displaced Europeans after World War II. And this continued through the admission of over 100,000 Southeast Asian refugees during the Vietnam War. So those were our very early experiences as a country having a organized and federally supported refugee resettlement process. Today's program is managed by PRM. There are many acronyms in refugee resettlement, so I'm going to try to define as many as I am able. This is the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau, and then within PRM, there's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is known as ORR. And the United States right now resettles more refugees than any other country. And since PRM started, we've resettled more than 3 million refugees across the 50 states. So the admission of refugees to the US is authorized by a particular act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and that was later amended by the Refugee Act of 1980. So 1980 we typically think of as the beginning of the formalized resettlement program, with two purposes: to provide a uniform procedure for refugee admissions and authorize federal assistance to resettle refugees and promote self-sufficiency. And that federal assistance is what we're provided in order to help fund the support that new families need for those original 90 days. And the purpose of this legislation was, again, to have this more uniform response as opposed to just responding sort of ad hoc for each international crisis. So I described a little bit about the history of the program, and then I'll touch now on the presidential determination, which Dustin will speak about later too. Each year, the number of refugees that the US is permitted to admit is determined by the presidential administration in consultation with the Congress. So historically, between 1980 and today, the ceiling, the top number of refugees that the US is able to resettle has remained relatively constant across all different political affiliations, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. This has not been a partisan issue until very recently. But the president will determine that number. So right now, our number is 125,000. And it doesn't mean that we will necessarily resettle that number of individuals across the country, but we could, and we strive to. We typically do not get anywhere near the ceiling, and this year is a little bit different. And then overseas processing. Refugees have to meet certain criteria to be resettled in the US, and then they have to be referred to the US government for resettlement by either the United Nations, a US embassy, or certain designated NGOs or international nonprofit organizations. So the process for refugees arriving in the US is very long. For most refugees, it takes between 2 and 10 years and can take even longer. They're some of the most highly vetted people who are in our country. They are going through intensive process in the country that they're coming from, and that might be their country of origin, or sometimes it's another country that they've, crossed a border or escaped to, and now they're seeking permanent resettlement. Multiple US government agencies do security checks for all of these individuals, and then that's presented to our Department of Homeland Security. They complete an in-person interview with a refugee officer, and then it's decided if they're able to come to the US. If they're approved, then they receive an additional medical screening. They receive cultural orientation in the country that they're coming from. That gives them some preliminary information about the United States. They receive a travel loan, and that covers the cost of their airfare. And then that money must be repaid by that family to the government later on. I think a lot of people are not aware that that's a requirement of these folks. And then they prepare to travel. We receive notification that they're on their way, and I'll describe some of the steps in between that, and then they arrive. So I want to say this is the typical and formal resettlement process. We've also resettled Afghans and Ukrainians in the past couple of years, and that process has been a little bit different. The US government set up those folks as humanitarian parolees so that they would have a little more streamlined process to be able to escape an emergency situation and come to the United States. So that's a lot faster. As I mentioned before, reception and placement, or RMP, this is the federally funded program where we provide support for those 90 days. And on the next slide, this just gives a little of an outline of how the flow works. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement is with the federal government. They receive a certain number of people twice a week who are ready to be resettled. They've gone through all the vetting in another country. And then there are 10 VOLAGs, which stands for Voluntary Agency. You see them all listed there. And these are the agencies that are permitted to resettle individuals. So our VOLAG at Hello Neighbor is the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, which is USCRI. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, let's say they have 200 people who've been approved. They provide that list to the 10 VOLAGs who get on a Zoom call twice a week, and one by one go through every single case. And then raise their hand and say, we can take that case. It's a medical case. We know in Pittsburgh they have hospitals. We'll send them to Pittsburgh. We see that this case has a US tie in Austin, Texas. We'll take that case. We have a partner. We can send them to Austin, Texas. And that's the process through which we receive our assignments of who will resettle. I'm going to let Dustin touch on these a little bit later, but we're the agency level as Hello Neighbor. And then we're responsible for all of these core services within those 90 days with that resettlement team that you saw at the beginning. Next slide. So transportation is one of the big things we're responsible for, providing transportation to job interviews and job training, making sure that we have the right number of car seats. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're driving clients everywhere. It's actually really important that we provide bus orientations and that folks understand how to use our transportation system. We can provide them with bus passes, and that really sets them up for self-sufficiency. But a number of our volunteers and staff will also drive clients to medical appointments, to job interviews, and whatever else is needed. We also are responsible for providing culturally appropriate meals. This is not my slide. I do see that word is misspelled. But when somebody arrives in the US on the first day, we have to have food that's available from their culture, a hot meal. Volunteers have certainly helped us with this. We work with a lot of local restaurants that are immigrant and refugee owned also. And we make sure that clients are aware of where grocery stores are in their area that can provide culturally appropriate food. And then we do 2 required home visits. So one happens either the day a family arrives or the next day, and then there's a 30-day home visit And we go over all of the details of the services that we'll be able to provide, how they can let us know if they have any concerns, what support is going to look like, and just go over all of those details. Cultural orientation is another really important core service that we provide. As I mentioned before, that starts overseas. So there's cultural orientation that they receive in the country they're leaving from, and then in the US. This covers a variety of topics, including health and hygiene, US laws, employment, calling 911, when and how you do that, who different officials are that you could reach out to and how. And actually, Osby and I are working on developing more structure around our cultural orientation. So there will be even more opportunities for volunteers to participate in delivering presentations, welcoming families with food for these sessions, helping with bus orientations for them to get there. But these are super important. And then the next slide just provides a quick list of all of the core services that we provide between pre-arrival and arrival. So you see a variety of those there.
Sorry, our internet's glitching a little, but we're back.
The only one maybe that I didn't touch on is public benefits. So we'll help clients enroll in SNAP, which is the food stamp program. We'll enroll them in our employment programs or in cash assistance, whatever they're eligible for. And then this all is in partnership with USCRI. So this year we're slated to resettle 320 individuals. And then just briefly, so I actually pulled these from the impact reports, which you can find on our website. So if you want more detail, that's a good place to find it. But we became a resettlement agency in this year between 2021 and 2022. And right after we became a resettlement agency, there was the massive evacuation from Afghanistan, and then a few months later, Ukraine. So that was how we entered as a resettlement agency, which is a pretty tough time to start out. And we've learned a lot since then. But in that year, we had originally expected to resettle 100 people during the year, and we ended up resettling almost 200 in those first 3 to 6 months. And then 2022 to 2023, you can see we resettled 20 families, 82 individuals, and you can see all of the countries also that people. So there are a variety of resettlement agencies around the US. USCRI, for example, has resettlement field offices. So there's a USCRI Erie, for example, and a USCRI Cleveland. Those are resettlement agencies that are sort of like sub-organizations of the main VOLAG, USCRI. And then there are organizations like Hello Neighbor that are affiliates. I think one of the things that makes Hello Neighbor really unique in this space is that we started as a grassroots community-based organization. All of our original programming was based on community needs and wraparound services. And so that was where we started. So we didn't start with the 90-day checklist of core services. We started with our other programs, and then we could use that to inform the work that we do in resettlement. And just a quick snapshot of our other programs on the next slide. And to give you a sense of how we've developed over time. The blue birds with the clocks, these are the early bird programs. So when Dustin and I joined the team a little over 3 years ago, those were the programs that existed at Hello Neighbor. So mentorship was our first program, Smart Start for new and expecting moms, and those fell within family services. And then the national network, which Dustin is going to speak to. And then we've grown a lot since then. So you see where RMP, reception and placement, falls underneath resettlement, just beside employment and legal services. And there are a lot of ways for volunteers to be involved. We really rely on the support of our volunteers to do resettlement effectively. It really takes the full community, and it's really meaningful and important for families to get to interact with their new Pittsburgh neighbors. So these are some of the ways that you can support. There are so many others. So if you are interested in volunteering, please do let Aubrey, myself, the info email know. And I'm going to pass it over to Dustin to speak about the national work.
And as Dustin starts his presentation, just a reminder that you can drop questions in the chat as we go. OSFI is catching everything that's put in the chat. So we'll get to Q&A at the end. If you want a placeholder, you can put them in the chat. And also, I meant to say this earlier, but I'll be sharing out the slides and recording afterwards. So I know it's a lot of information. You'll be able to go back and review at your leisure as well. So with that.
Thanks, Aubrey and Rachel. So hopefully, I would hope that everyone on this call has at least heard of the Hello Neighbor Network. Completely understand if not, because there's a lot going on here in Pittsburgh. But we have a national facing program as well. That's this network. When Sloan was sort of building out Hello Neighbor around 2018, 2019, she was receiving a lot of inquiries from other organizations, locally or around the country, who were curious about, asking basic best practices or different models. How are you doing this? Sloan essentially fielded a couple hundred of these inquiries, found a small group that was doing similar work to Hello Neighbor in terms of being a grassroots organization, quite young, figuring things out, and convened them together to form sort of informally at first this Hello Neighbor network. The network addresses sort of this gap that exists in grassroots and community-based nonprofit organizations where these leaders are starting to learn the business of being a nonprofit and identifying community need and building programming, but lacked their own sort of community of leaders to help learn from one another and to grow their skills and confidence. So this is essentially where the network fits in. If we go to the next slide, you'll also see here an important part of taking off the Hello Neighbor Network was this Refugee Nonprofit Impact Index that we conducted, I guess would be the right word. Through surveying these nonprofit leaders and getting information from their communities as well, we were able to get some of these high-level takeaways to help sort of justify why this community is important and should exist. We know that it says here 71% of refugees share a meal with a US-born person at least once a month after getting involved with a local nonprofit. 100% of refugees agree that an organization makes people in their community feel more welcome. Volunteers expressed a similar feeling, I suppose. So this is all the information we use to sort of pull together this national-facing coalition of grassroots organizations. Moving to the next slide, we see sort of our initial pilot. You see on the map there, those are the original organizations that Sloan pulled together. They all convened here in Pittsburgh at City of Asylum for the sort of inaugural gathering. There was that national research study I mentioned, as well as a handful of trainings and webinars. And then it's listed here as a result of just that initial participation and exploring what the network could be. These, I believe it's 7 or 8 organizations were able to raise over $200,000 that they could attribute in some way to their participation in the network. So we knew we were onto something pretty good, and that's when Rachel came on sort of full time to help really develop the network into a full-fledged program. And the next slide for our second year sort of displays what that looked like. You can actually see Rachel and I in the screenshot there, which is funny. We've been at it. We essentially tripled the size of the community, adding 16 additional organizations. So we really saw the value and decided to really invest into this national facing program. We had a virtual convening that year for reasons that we probably all know, COVID-19. We actually heard that we were able to address the needs of over 15,000 local clients in these communities that are shown on this map through network programming, whether that be knowledge sharing or our resilience grants program, where we are able to sort of directly support niche areas of need in these organizations and communities that funders might not always be able to address in their grant making. In 2021, we distributed over $103,000 in re-grant funding. So we really took off this year. This was also when we participated in the Mobilizing Fund. That was an additional 150,000 we distributed as part of a larger $1.2 million investment from a variety of stakeholders for Afghan-specific support due to the fall of Kabul and an influx of Afghans beginning that year pretty intensely. The following year is, I believe, when I stepped in to join Rachel on this team and this journey of the network. We added 21 additional organizations, so sort of unchecked growth when we were getting on board here. The 60 organizations that I mentioned in the Learning Collaborative, that was tied to that mobilizing fund effort. Thankfully, this year we were able to host our in-person convening and sort of solidify what our programming is at its core, what our bread and butter is in terms of hosting speakers and creating environments for our members to gather and discuss issues. We also were able to visit in person 3 sites, I guess, member sites this year, which is really exciting. And then looking to last year, we added an additional 20 organizations. We implemented new programming components to try to broaden how much of an organization could participate in the network. So it wasn't just the executive director, but sort of a bench building process of other emerging leaders in their organization who could also engage in the ways that would be most valuable for them. We also started development this year of this really exciting organizational health tool that our fearless national data and learning manager, Alex, has pulled together. And that brings us finally to this year. We have 16 additional organizations. This brings us to representation in a total of 26 states. I believe we have a solid 60 organizations who are actively enrolled in our programming. We recently, at the start of March, hosted our 4th in-person convening. We launched this organizational health tool and we're actively piloting it right now, getting feedback from our members. And then other sort of items here, but essentially we're really trying to hone our community, what programming we offer, and what we do really well. So that's just sort of an overview of the national work we do and our perspective into maybe some larger trends in national resettlement. I could probably talk about this for hours, as I'm sure Rachel could, but some of the largest trends that we're seeing right now in terms of the national landscape of resettlement, of course, is urgency. Rachel mentioned that presidential determination number. The exact figure is escaping me, but I believe in 2020, when sort of the swap from the previous president to the Biden administration happened, our presidential determination was below, I think, 30,000 refugees annually. So the fact that currently we have 125,000 as our cap for admissions this year, within 4 years of that very low benchmark, there's been a ton of expansion, rapid expansion and growth of organizations like Hello Neighbor, the caseload that VOLAGs are able to take on. So especially now with the looming domestic tensions that this year holds, there's a lot of motivation from PRM and from all stakeholders to really get as many folks into the country as possible so that we can hit that 125,000 threshold. As of today, there's less than 6 months to reach this determination. So the time pressure is definitely real. One sort of manifestation of this is the introduction of non-traditional resettlement programs. Rachel talked about R&P and sort of the core services that are provided in our federal traditional resettlement programming. Some of you might have heard of Welcome Corps. Welcome Corps is sort of a new cutting-edge program. They're in their 2nd year right now, where communities of local residents, just people who are passionate about welcoming their neighbors, are able to help sponsor a refugee arrival or a refugee family, and essentially check off all the boxes that a resettlement agency would as another pathway to just get more people into the country. There's a lot to figure out with this program, but ultimately there's a lot of excitement about it. It's been growing really quickly. I believe currently they're on schedule to admit over 10,000 refugees into the country through Welcome Corps by the end of the fiscal year, which is super impressive. That's one example. Another would be these sort of virtual resettlement pathways that we're starting to see. These are also very cutting edge, but essentially trying to minimize the amount of capacity that's needed to get folks through the resettlement program while still making sure they're provided with the services they need. There's also an exciting opportunity with the network. Actually, right now, we're partnered with the International Rescue Committee and PRM to allow our members, all of whom are grassroots nonprofit organizations, to essentially serve as proxy resettlement agencies like Hello Neighbor through the end of the fiscal year without having to go through the really arduous process of applying formally to become a resettlement agency. I believe right now we're over 200 arrivals. I believe we're anticipating could be resettled through that program. We're actively figuring it out right now. We're on calls with IRC. So it's just another example of how we're all sort of coming together last minute here and really trying to get as close to that 125 as possible. And then this next slide sort of illustrates that point where, Hello Neighbor is that agency option in the top left, which is the standard traditional refugee resettlement institution. And then there's all these other sorts of models that are popping up and being expanded into, like community sponsorship and co-sponsorship, which would be sort of maybe that welcome core example. Remote placement is sort of with our opportunity with the IRC, something we're leaning into, because IRC typically has like a limit to how far from another resettlement agency they can do remote placement. And thankfully, PRM has just sort of allowed us to go as far as we need to through the end of the fiscal year to get as many network organizations to participate as possible. So these are the set definitions, but right now as we're exploring all these different models, there's a lot of hybrids and overlap that, these aren't exactly as clear cut as they once were. And this next year will tell us a lot about what the future might look like. No, it's perfect. Other trends we're seeing include a real centering of leaders who have lived migration experience themselves. I think this is maybe a trend across the board with our just culture and society, but especially we're noticing in refugee and immigrant advocacy and resettlement leadership. Examples, the Office of New Americans from the American Immigration Council, which is more state level advocacy policy focused. The council here from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, grassroots coalitions like the network. There's a lot of centering of stakeholders and trying to elevate those who have lived experience within them. And then, of course, there's differences across communities in terms of what resources are available and what's most critical, but there are several areas that there's always need, regardless of what community you're in. Nationally, housing is constantly a concern. There's shortages and costs of living are rising, so you might see Hello Neighbor post a lot about, looking for apartment connections or housing, and it's true across the country. Same goes with employment and legal services, and then mental health services as well, which is, the difference between surviving and thriving in the United States as a new arrival, and trying to expand more towards how can we really make someone have a full, fulfilling life in the United States and not just a roof over their head and food to eat. It's a balance of these things and resources, but these are some of the overarching areas we're noticing right now that are sure to evolve after this year's election.
Thank you. That was amazing. I feel like I actually learned a lot, especially, as the volunteer and community engagement manager, I work a lot with our local programs. So it's always really exciting to hear more about the national perspective, especially from Dustin, who is interacting every single week, probably most days, with different network partners. With that, we have time for Q&A, so please keep putting questions in the chat, and I'm going to go to some of the questions that have already been sent in. I do want to say that this recording will be available to you all. The slides will be available as well. I'm going to additionally make sure that we publish links for our future webinars on the website. So I'll remind you again at the end of the session, but mark your calendars for May 8th. Let me make sure I have the dates right. Wednesday, May 8th and Wednesday, June 5th. May 8th, we're going to be talking about building community and social connections for our new neighbors. And then on June 5th, we're going to be focusing on access to healthcare for newly arrived refugees and immigrants, recognizing that just because something is available doesn't mean it's accessible. So we'll talk about what true accessibility looks like for healthcare. So with that in mind, please send in some questions. I'm seeing a few in the chat. One question, let's see. One question that was asked is, can volunteers be given the name and info of newly arrived families when they arrive at the airport? How do you provide bus training? Do you use public transportation employees? So it's a set of questions. For volunteers, we try to keep client information confidential whenever possible. For bus training, that's provided by staff or volunteers to clients. And if you're interested in helping new neighbors learn how to use the bus system, we're happy to train you. I have written and video training materials. And we can also connect you to a staff member, so you can shadow a staff member giving a bus orientation and do it afterwards. And then for using public transportation employees, we do when necessary. One time a client got confused on a bus line and I was able to call Pittsburgh Regional Transit to help me locate them on the bus and get them safely home. But typically, no, the training is provided by staff or volunteers. And then the next question is, does the caseworker need specific qualifications before being hired? I'd like to direct to Rachel.
Sure. Yes. So you'll see if you're ever on our website and looking at Hello Neighbors job postings, we're very clear about what the requirements are. We don't have specific degree requirements because we know people come into case management work in many different ways. So we do have case managers who have masters in social work. We have other case managers who've been through this process themselves and have interpreted for resettlement agencies. So we're looking for people who have that social work experience, whether it's through a degree program or not. And then we provide a lot of onboarding and training once someone has been hired.
Another question that I'd like to direct to Dustin is, I had no idea that Hello Neighbor network was so large or that it had grown so fast. Do you anticipate that it will continue to grow?
As long as there's a need among grassroots communities and grassroots leaders, the network intends to be here supporting them. So what that looks like definitely depends on what the national landscape looks like and what different policy, legislation, leadership exists in the United States. But yeah, we're here. We're not planning on going anywhere, and as much as we can, we're going to keep growing to accommodate our community's needs.
And then a general question, can you speak to the availability of mental health care for minors and adults?
So I think that this would be a great question. I think you have probably Abby Jo coming to present on the health session in June. I think she'll have a lot of specific information. What I can share is that I think one important baseline piece of information is that the idea of mental health is very different in different cultures. So we have a network member who has a PhD and she's a psychologist, and she shared that in some cultures, therapy or therapist translates to the equivalent of crazy doctor. So there is a lot of stigma in some countries around mental health and therapy to begin with. So often we do have clients who've faced a lot of trauma and probably would benefit from mental health services, and they might not identify that themselves. So that's something that we can help do when case managers and case aides notice that these types of things are coming up, and that they could have those conversations with them. I know Resolve is one of the organizations that we partner with that can provide support, and we will also partner with local nonprofits and support services to make sure that interpretation is provided. But there are a number of different barriers to receiving mental health services. We're actually just about to start a program called Keystone Connections at Hello Neighbor. Our coordinator just started on Monday, and that program is for wellness and mental health support for 4 different communities, and we'll have 4 liaisons from those communities that can have those culturally appropriate conversations with clients and figure out the best way to get them support.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question is, of all the steps that Hello Neighbor does to support refugees coming to Pittsburgh, what are the most challenging for the organization or team?
Housing. Housing is really complicated. So sometimes we have 6 weeks notice before a family arrives, and that gives us more time to identify a good housing opportunity for them. It's easier to find housing if it's for 6 people and 3 of them are gonna be able to work, because that means they'll be able to afford a little bit more per month. We have more options to choose from. Sometimes we get 24 hours notice and somebody's coming tomorrow and we have to figure out where we're taking them. So that's one of our big challenges, and we have limited funding available. We don't want to put people in a housing situation that they're not going to be able to afford. So we have to navigate a lot of transitional housing. We typically use Airbnb, and we have had in a unique case had a volunteer provide housing for a family. But I would say that's one of our big challenges. Also finding employers who are not only excited about hiring refugees, but who are willing to put in a little work to make sure that they're supported. So we have some great employer partners who will help provide transportation. If we can find 12 clients who are ready and willing to work somewhere, but they need a van to pick them up and travel there, or maybe they require interpretation for some on-the-job training. We're always looking for employers who are willing to sort of take those extra steps to support clients. We have a number of different challenges, and actually, I think volunteers help bridge the gap for many of them. Transportation is another big challenge, but if people are comfortable on the bus system, with the support of volunteers and staff, that really makes a big difference. But housing and employment are the two that come to mind right away.
A question I'd like to take and then open if y'all have anything to add is, are there any events to engage and interact with refugees to grow a broader understanding? So I want to plug our community potluck coming up on Sunday, May 19th. You can find it on our social media. We'll be putting it on our website as well. There's an Eventbrite, but it's an event that gathers our community together here in Pittsburgh. So it's a mix of current and former clients, of volunteers, staff, funders, supporters, and anyone else from our community who wants to come. It'll be at Highland Park at the Rhododendron Shelter. Again, you can find all that info online, so that's a great place to start. But if you're looking to build connections with people from other backgrounds, Dustin showed some great research on why that's so good for all of us. I'd highly recommend going to our Get Involved page on our website. Consider signing up for an info session. That's how you can get connected to resources to prepare us all for culturally sensitive, trauma-informed interactions. And it's also where you can get connected to opportunities where you'll interact directly with people from all over the world. Our mentorship program is a great way to build those relationships as well. And at our May webinar, May 8th, Jenny, who runs that program, will be talking more about building community in general, but about mentorship in particular. So definitely join us May 8th if you can. Anything y'all want to add to that?
That's great.
I would add, I'm a learning enjoyer. So I love learning about the space and different areas of the world and our clients and nonprofit management, just generally. So some areas you might want to check out, switchboardta.org. Switchboard is a website facilitated by ORR that's just a treasure trove of refugee and immigration related resources. So if you're ever looking to just explore, that's a great site to do so. There's also the American Immigration Council, which is very data survey focused. So if you're more of a numbers person, the American Immigration Council's reports are fascinating. And then I would also suggest signing up for the newsletter of the National Partnership for New Americans. It's MPNA. They offer regularly free webinars and workshops to learn about different elements of resettlement, and then also just great resources to learn from as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Well, there's other questions, but we are coming up on our time. We have our info@helloneighbor.io email address up on the screen right now. So please, if you have additional questions, I know someone was asking about resource sharing from for cultural orientation information, please reach out to us there. I actually field those emails, so I'll either answer directly or connect you with the relevant staff member. So we'd love to hear from you. And just in conclusion, I want to say thank you for coming, and thank you in general for being part of our community. The goal of putting on these webinars is to open the door a little bit and make sure that we're being transparent and open about the challenges we're facing and also about the work we're doing. We want all of you to have access to all the information you want about how refugee resettlement works nationally and internationally, but also right here in Pittsburgh. So thank you for your time. Reach out with any additional questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you, and mark your calendars for May 8th webinar, our May 19th potluck, and then the June 5th webinar coming up as well. Anything else to add before we wrap up?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much, and hope to see you soon.